Thank you for having me. I'm just going to turn off my video for the actual talk itself, so I'm just not as distracting from the actual important message here. I've been asked here by some of the people in this room to kind of give a talk similar to one that I've done at other municipalities regarding health impacts of leaded aviation fuel to communities proximate to these airports. And so since I've been doing these talks, a lot of new information has come out. For example, the EPA actually did announce an endangerment finding in October of last year, officially stating that, yes, this indeed is a health effect. And indeed, they do actually correlate avgas fuel sales and activity at airports to blood lead levels, with even the EPA director saying that the science is clear. Exposing the lead can cause irreversible and lifelong health effects in children, and that aircrafts that use leaded fuel are the dominant source of emissions in our air today. And this is true across Colorado as well. If we actually look at the 2017 EPA emissions inventory, we can actually see that oh, I see, it's kind of cut off a little bit. It's not, there's not too much over there. The aircraft emissions correspond to 72% of lead emissions into our environment today. And if you actually look at the national emissions inventory, you can see that the aircraft is on the top with almost a ton of emissions in Colorado in 2017. And if you look at all other sources of lead from industry and other areas, that only amounts to about 8,000 pounds or under half a ton. If you zoom in even further at this national emissions inventory and actually look at these pinpoint locations where these sources come from, you can actually see very large hotspots of lead emissions. And these are actually our airports in the area. You can see Boulder here with 284 pounds of lead emissions in 2017. Erie over here with 526 pounds of lead emissions in the year. And these have only gone up in recent years. We can actually calculate the 2022 amounts of lead emitted by the amount of lead fuel sales done at the various airports. At Boulder Airport, for example, it's now up to 488, while Erie Airport is actually down to 223 pounds. And these will be very important numbers later because there will be a correlation between Erie Airport and Boulder Municipal Airport. Now, before I get too much further, I have to talk about what type of airplanes use these leaded fuels. We're not talking about the big passenger planes at DIA. Those use other things, other fuels such as that are based off of kerosene. We're talking about the piston aircrafts, the propeller aircrafts that come in and out of BDU. They solely use leaded fuel, and that lead has to go somewhere once it's emitted. And thus it goes into the environment and it drops down on the people below. So the goal I'm trying to reach across you today is help you to make an informed decision of the health effects from a avgas fuel, and make informed decision as to what is best for you and your family. Also, how the latest research pertains to Boulder Municipal Airport, and finally, mitigation techniques to help protect you and your family. I was given a nice introduction, but it bears repeating who I am. I am a scientist. My background is in materials chemistry from UCLA. My advisor at the time specialized in embedding these nanomaterials in cell membranes as biosensors, kind of shown here on the right, and worked heavily with leaded materials such as lead sulfide. And I wrote many standard operating procedures for using these lead nanomaterials, so that way I don't expose myself, my colleagues, or my family at home. So I know how dangerous these particles can actually be. I also worked at the HRL lab on lead sulfide and lead selenide nanocrystals for military applications. And finally, I came out to Colorado in 2019 when I got a fellowship from the National Research Council to work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Now, I don't call myself the authoritative voice on this subject in Colorado. That belongs to Dr. Zaran, who also is from Colorado. He has done many works on correlating lead in children nearby airports, and actually authored the research paper on the Reed Hillview study. But my work I'm going to be showing you today, not my work, but the work I'll be showing you today is peer-reviewed public research, which means not only the scientists that conducted the research, the editors who are on the board for publicizing the research, and the reviewers who look over and make sure that the science is up to snuff. All experts in their fields stand behind this work and say that yes, these are correct conclusions from this data. This also involves doctors and other scientists as well. So to understand how lead affects humans and those proximate to airports, you have to understand toxicity, which is kind of categorized in under three main factors. The first is how often an individual comes into contact with this toxin, how much material is required to affect the body, and how readily the toxin penetrates the body and how quickly the body can detoxify. So first, let's talk a little bit about how often an individual comes into contact with this toxin. And so you can kind of categorize this in two different categories: acute toxicity, where you basically come across it once, and then your body has time to expel it and detoxify itself, and constant long-term exposure, where your body doesn't have time to detoxify itself, but the toxin builds up in your system over time, leading to health effects. They say a picture says 1,000 words, and here is a picture of Boulder County, and here are the overflight impacts for June of 2021 across Boulder County from specifically piston aircraft that use leaded fuel. Now, there are different types of work that happens, and I'll be focusing on one, which is the touch and goes, because these ones burn the most fuel because you're constantly taking off and landing, which requires the thrust to lift off, therefore using the most lead emissions. But you're not exactly safe either from all these overflights, because every single plane that passes over a school, a park, a daycare, that is lead exposure to those on the ground, because the lead must go somewhere and it falls to those on the ground instead. So, like I mentioned, touch and goes create the most lead emissions. This is due to the fact that during the takeoff and landing cycle, about 80% of the lead is emitted during the departure phase of the landing and takeoff cycle. This makes sense. They're trying to generate lift to get off the ground. In order to generate that power, they need to burn more fuel. So this is where, and so what ends up happening is you create these epicenters or hotspots of lead emission, which is why when I showed you the 2017 lead emissions map, you saw that the airports emitted 2 orders of magnitude higher lead than anything else in the vicinity. So can we actually measure this lead in communities? And the answer is it's a little bit difficult, but some people have made efforts to do this. I was part of one such effort in Superior, where we actually measured the lead levels in 9 homes and found that over 18 samples, every single home had lead inside of it. These were homes that did not have lead paint or lead pipes. Therefore, the lead had to come from outside. But more recently, other communities have taken charge and actually tested their own communities. And I wanted to highlight one such community. Down in Centennial, they actually tested parks under the touch and go pattern work in their communities. They were very smart about it, and they decided to take wipe samples over surfaces where children might play. This includes swings, slides, benches, climbing structures, and they sent it out to a lab to quantify how much lead was on these surfaces. For comparison, we can look at something that the EPA looks at for inside homes for surfaces. The reason why I compare it to this is if the EPA determines that these levels are unsafe inside of a home, why would it be safe on a playground where children would expose themselves and basically induce the toxin inside of their body or expose themselves to this toxin? So the current standard is 10 micrograms per square foot on top of surfaces. Now, there's a proposed change that recently came about that this would actually be reduced to about 3 micrograms per square foot. In this park, nearly every single surface was higher than 10 micrograms per square foot, and every single one was higher than 3 micrograms per square foot. Now, there's been a lot of contention over data sets like this, because people might say, well, this might be just the naturally abundant amount of lead in the area. This could just be natural dust that is just accumulating in the area. However, if you look more closely at the data, this is impossible. So the group in Centennial also took soil samples further away from these parks, and they found that the natural concentration, or the naturally abundant amount of lead in the soil, was about 6 micrograms per gram. Now, that means that in order to reach this 18.5 micrograms in that square foot, you would need 3 grams of dirt of that natural abundance to create that 18 microgram sample. Now, I have a little bit of show and tell here. I do apologize for those online who can't see it, but I do actually have what that looks like in amount of dirt. I have here in the vial what that would be, and also I have here on this cloth what that would look like. They can pass it around and take a look. But for those who can't see online, this cloth is absolutely filthy. And this vial, which is about 5 milliliters, is filled to basically the brim. So it's a lot of material that is required. If you actually think about it in terms of tablespoons, this is a little bit over half a tablespoon of material on a surface or on some or material you would have to have. Here's what that wipe looked like, and here's what the surface looked like. It is nowhere near as dirty as is required for it to have that amount of lead on the surface. The only way this can happen is if there's a high concentration of lead emission in the area that deposits on the surface along with other dust. And as I mentioned before, these hotspots are these airports. So I talked briefly about how often we're exposed, and it turns out we're exposed pretty darn often due to all these overflights. So it's this constant exposure of lead that's going to build up in our systems. Well, how much is actually required to affect the human body? Now, it's not really well known for adults and for elderly how much or how it actually affects you, these small amounts of lead in time. That more studies have been focused on children. And there's actually a lot of evidence that shows that children are most susceptible to lead. Even the smallest quantities can cause lower IQ, decreased ability to pay attention in school, and underperformance in school. And these are permanent adverse health effects. These go on for the rest of their lives, causing societal effects as well, including lower earning of pay, lower scores in tests, not getting into a college of their choice, on and on and on. So children are extremely susceptible to this. There's a lot of evidence for this. So one that I really like to highlight because it's very A/B test. Back when NASCAR decided to ban leaded fuel at their racetracks, they actually looked at children who went to school nearby these racetracks. So they looked at a cohort of children who were exposed to lead during the racing and a new cohort of children who were not exposed to lead. And they found that the new children who came on in had higher test scores compared to those who were exposed to lead. There was no change in teachers, no change in curriculum. The only change was the fact that they were not exposed to lead. And again, they actually looked at the long-term expected income of these children who were exposed to lead, and they found that they had a reduction in income of about $5,200 per child. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but there's been other studies that have said that if you increase a child's blood lead levels by 1 microgram per deciliter, that is a societal cost of $71,000 per child. That adds up quickly when you start to look at the environment and how many children are affected and are proximate to these airports. Even further, there's been studies looking at expectant mothers, and they've been shown that even at the first few micrograms of exposure have strong effects on their IQ. They've been shown that there's no low threshold, no lower bound, and no lower threshold for lead exposure that is safe. And even at the lowest level of detection, about 2 micrograms per deciliter, there are quantifiable, measurable IQ deficiencies. So by the time you actually detect lead in children's blood, it is already too late. And why the EPA and the CDC has stated there's no safe levels for lead exposure for children. Now, why is this the case? Why are children so susceptible to lead? Well, it turns out that lead actually inhibits the calcium pathways of the neurons. So when children are growing, they're trying to make those neural connections, trying to learn, the lead inhibits that. Thus, it affects their test grades. Thus, it affects their ability to learn in school, and it affects them later on in life. And they carry this adverse health effect forever. So now we know that we're constantly being exposed to lead. We know that it takes very little to, and there's no safe amount of lead exposure for children. How readily does a toxin penetrate the body, and how quickly can the body detoxify? Unfortunately, for the detoxification process, there's no good way for you to actually get rid of lead from your body. your kidneys, which is the main filtration device, do not handle heavy metals super well. You actually have to go to, it takes a long time for your body to actually get rid of the lead compared to other things like salts, sodium, to create that balance in your blood. Now, for how readily does the toxin penetrate into your body? Well, that depends on the nature of the toxin and what form it comes in. So, for example, if I were to put a kilogram of lead in front of you right now, while alarming that would be, it would not actually be considered dangerous by the EPA or the CDC. You cannot ingest it. You cannot breathe it in. You cannot inject it. It's not in a form that can harm you. However, if I start chopping up this lead into smaller and smaller bits, at some point you are going to be able to inhale it, you are going to be able to ingest it, and you are going to be able to inject it. Don't recommend doing that, but it's possible. So at what level, though, does it actually become dangerous? It turns out that there's actually a Goldilocks region that below a certain threshold, you are actually able to bypass your natural defenses in your body and enter into your bloodstream. So this work was done by Button and Kessimer and colleagues in 2012 and 2013, and found that nanoparticles over 40 nanometers in size, your body seems to slough off, you can cough it out, you can expel it, no problem. But 18 nanometers in size and smaller, those ones can penetrate into the cells, and your body's natural defenses of coughing and sneezing no longer work. So someone named Griffith, Dr. Griffith, went and started to study the nature of these lead emissions from piston engine aircrafts. And so he looked at a plane that is very similar to one that comes in and out of Boulder Municipal Airport here. And he captured the emissions from these lead nanoparticles. And he characterized them. He found that, on average, they were about 13 nanometers in size. These lead nanoparticles are 13 nanometers in size, which is the perfect size to penetrate the mucosal barriers in the lung and be readily uptaken by the epithelial cells, leading to higher toxicity of this avgas. He also compared these particle sizes, to aircraft. And you can see here, aircraft, he's doing a histogram or counting up statistically the average particle size of aircraft and antiquated automobile emissions from leaded automobile. And you can see here that automobiles' particle sizes are much, much larger compared to aircraft. And in fact, right here where I'm putting my laser pointer is the 18 nanometer mark of the threshold between will it penetrate the cells and will it not penetrate the cells. You can see the aircraft particulate is well below that threshold and can easily penetrate into your body. So just by breathing it in, you're exposing yourself. Now, a lot of people say that, well, we're doing better because we have gotten rid of automobile lead from the automobile. So we've gotten rid of over 90% of lead in the environment. But the issue with that is they don't realize that leaded avgas is far more toxic compared to the banned leaded automobile fuel of the past. And therefore, children proximate to communities are going to feel a much larger effect compared to automobile avgas. So how do we put this all together? Because we've talked about how we are constantly exposed to lead. We've talked about how little is required to actually affect children and how easily is uptaken into the human body. Well, Dr. Zaran and colleagues did this study at the Reed Hillview Airport, and I'm going to quickly try to summarize the outcomes from that. So they looked at 14,000 blood lead samples of children under the age of 5 residing nearby Reed Hillview Airport in Santa Clara County, California. And during those tests, they found that children proximate to this airport indeed had higher levels of lead compared to others. More importantly, those who were downwind had higher blood lead levels. They saw increase in blood lead levels with increased quantities of avgas sold. And they saw increase in blood lead levels with increased piston engine activity, which makes sense. The more emissions, the more you're going to uptake it into your body, and the higher blood lead levels are going to be. This was the catalyst that actually started the EPA endangerment finding that finally threw it over the edge, and it's cited many, many, many times in the EPA endangerment finding that finally took it across the finish line. So let's kind of dig into the data a little bit and see exactly how much children are affected. Now, because I don't know why, but even though the CDC and the EPA says that no level of lead is safe, some people want to know, well, exactly how much am I actually getting involved in? The good and bad and the ugly of the Reed-Hillview Airport data is kind of summarized here in this graph, where it kind of looks at the predicted blood lead levels compared to amount of fuel sold at the airport. And depending upon how close you are to the airport, you are going to see different levels of lead exposure. Now, this is kind of summarized here on the right, where if you are within half a mile of the airport, they saw 0.92 micrograms per deciliter increase in children's blood lead levels over a 60-day period. And then at 0.5 to 1.5, they saw 1.6 micrograms per deciliter increase in blood lead levels over a 60-day period. The ugly part about that is if you look at children 2 and under, this effect was doubled. So you're looking at 0.32 micrograms per deciliter and 1.8 micrograms per deciliter. If you want to compare it to something that is in recent memory of a lead crisis that made the news world nationwide, you can look at the Flint water crisis, which Dr. Zahran also looked at. At the height of the Flint water crisis, children's blood lead levels surged by an estimated 0.35 to 0.45 micrograms per deciliter over baseline levels. So the amount of lead exposure for children within 1.5 miles of this airport is just as bad, if not worse, than the Flint water crisis. And this is over a 60-day period. Like I said, your body doesn't do a good job of removing lead from its system. So over time, lead will build up, and you're going to start having these adverse health effects. Now, I've gotten a lot of complaints before. People say, well, that's California. Like, this is not Colorado. That's a different altitude, a different weather pattern. It's, you know, it's a them thing. Like we can't compare it to Colorado. Well, now we can. Recently, the Colorado Department of Public Health looked at children proximate to 12 airports across Colorado. Now, I need to disclose that Boulder was not one of them, but Erie was. And I mentioned Boulder now sells more fuel than Erie did in 2022. And the paper states that they saw this trend at every single airport across Colorado. So here is the same exact chart. They looked at distance and average blood lead levels. And they saw that as you got closer to the airport, they saw increased levels of average blood lead levels. If you are downwind, if you're upwind, so you're basically 0 days downwind, this is going to be this blue graph right here. So it kind of goes up from 2 micrograms per deciliter up to 2.2 micrograms per deciliter. And then if you are downwind for 21 of the 60 days, they saw it go up much, much higher. Now, I've gotten, again, some complaints from people saying, well, you know, it's 2.2 micrograms per deciliter. That's not that bad. It's below the CDC threshold level. Again, this is an average. And with that average becomes a distribution underneath this. So and you're basically pushing more children up above that CDC threshold level when you start moving the average up. And again, this 2.2 micrograms per deciliter is affecting them and has quantifiable and measurable IQ deficiencies. Something more interesting about this data, they actually look past 2 miles, and they actually see that this trend continues at 3, 4, and 5 miles from the airport. But at some point, the CDC says, well, once you get past a certain threshold, the amount of increase isn't that much, so it's a wash. And they kind of put that at 2 miles from the airports. So I just kind of want to go through some quotes from the paper because they kind of sum it up pretty well. So first, the results are generally consistent in magnitude, direction, and goodness of fit with those observed in 3 previous peer-reviewed studies that explicitly link proximity to airports and to children's blood lead levels, including the Reed-Hillview study. Living in proximity to airports has a small but statistically significant effect on the blood lead levels of children in Colorado. And the odds of having an elevated blood lead level greater than or equal to the current and previous CDC reference levels of 3.5 and 5 micrograms per deciliter showed that living 1 mile further from the airport lowered the odds of having an elevated blood lead level by 13.2 and 14.8% respectively. The opposite is true as well. 1 mile closer will increase your chances by that factor as well. And the conclusions are very telling as well. Consistent with previous studies, our analysis finds a small but significant increase in mean blood lead levels and the odds of exceeding CDC reference levels among children who live near airports servicing general aviation aircraft in Colorado. And results suggest the potential impact on children's blood lead levels is greatest at distance less than 2 miles from an airport. And you don't have to take my word for it either. Experts have weighed in on this as well, including Dr. Zaran in response in the Denver Post in response to the Colorado Department of Public Health study. When kids continue to have lead exposures over a prolonged period, the damage adds up to the point where they have worse scores on college entrance exams and tend to earn less in adulthood. And Dr. Bruce Lanfer, who was also co-author of the Reed Hillview study, testified in March in front of the Colorado Transportation Committee, stating that the blood lead levels seen in his study corresponded to an increase in miscarriages rates in women, increased behavioral issues in children, and lower test scores in school. And this paper says that they found the same magnitude of increase as the Reed Hillview study. So you are affecting people surrounding the airport to a very high degree. Now, what does that look like in Boulder? So we mentioned that if you're downwind, you're going to be affected a little bit more. And if you're close by, within 2 miles, you're going to be affected a lot more. So here is the predominant wind directions in Boulder based off of the windrows plot, where you can actually look up online and look at the average wind direction and speed over the last, I guess here was 14 years. You can see primarily it comes from the west by southwest and it travels to the northeast. So that's going to be the downwind direction, and also a little bit north going south. But if you recall in the previous thing, in the previous slide, the figure only said you had to be downwind for 21 of the 60 days. So there's still room for, you don't have to be always downwind to have these higher effects. So here's Boulder Municipal Airport. Here is within half a mile of the airport. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously because I don't know the area very well. I think where we're standing right here is within the half-mile area, but I definitely know that the Valmont Bike Park is within that half-mile distance. It's a great park. I see children there all the time, but it's really close to the airport. There's also residential, it looks like over here, that are close to the airport. 2 miles? I had to check this 3 times. It's quite a large distance, and it starts affecting not only Boulder City, but also Gun Barrel and further out. And again, there's no magic barrier that prevents lead from going from that 1.9 mile mark to the 2.1 mile mark. You're just affected less, just not that much less. Again, we can look at schools that are in this area. We can look at daycares within this area. It affects a large area of susceptible, vulnerable population, which is our children. So what can be done? As a scientist, I like to think about it in 3 steps. If you have a toxin, and this is how we do it at my work, it's done in multiple laboratories across the world. If you have a toxin, the first thing is, well, can you just get rid of it? Do you need to even have it around? Because if you can get rid of it, then there's no safety issue whatsoever. If you can't do that, you have to have it around because it's required for work, et cetera, et cetera. Well, can you reduce the amount that is being used? So that way you can lessen your exposure. The last line of defense is PPE, or personal protection equipment, because that is the last thing you want before you want to have all these other controls to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to this toxin. So to answer the question, can we just get rid of the leaded fuel? I wish I had a good answer for this, but unfortunately, due to the FAA Reauthorization Act, the FAA requires all current airports that have leaded avgas to continue providing leaded avgas until 2030, which means as long as Boulder Airport is there, it is going to continue to be an epicenter of lead. So can you reduce the amount of lead it's using at the airport? Well, something you can do is you can ask to offer unleaded fuel to the users at the airport. If you can switch them over to an unleaded variety, that would lower the lead exposure. Now, I wish I had a better answer for that as well, but it turns out that it's kind of hard to do. Not only do you have to have the infrastructure to house and deliver the lead, but also there's not a lot of good options. GAMI, which is 100 microliter, which is a this G100 unleaded right here, can be used by any general aviation aircraft. However, it's not widely available. And recently, a lot of distributors are boycotting its availability because it's not a standard FAA fuel, even though it's a drop-in for any of the aircrafts. They do not want the liability if something happens to that aircraft and it falls out of the sky. So they're actually boycotting the availability of this in some airports, this fuel. 94 unleaded, while it is available and is much more readily distributed, only 66% of current general aviation aircrafts can actually use it. And even if you provide it, doesn't mean everyone's going to switch over. There is a cost to switching over. It's not changing out their engine at all. There's no modifications they have to make. They just need to get a piece of paper from the FAA saying that, yes, you can use this this other type of fuel called a supplemental type certificate. It costs about $200 to $1,500 per aircraft, depending upon horsepower. Centennial started offering this last year, early in the summer, and not all their users have really adopted it. It costs money for them to switch over, and the fuel costs a bit more. So last I heard, only about 20% of the users are actually starting to use it, which is good, but if you're exposing so many children to these lead particles, is it really enough? And they're oftentimes mixing this 94 unleaded with the higher octane fuel, the ones who are using the unleaded fuel, so that way they can get to the octane levels they want, and it's kind of defeats the purpose. And I wouldn't expect a replacement anytime soon for this 100 low lead offering. Recently, in July 31st of this year, a candidate dropped out saying that the requirements the FAA is making on this replacement makes it impossible to have a drop-in replacement. So we're kind of stuck with this 2030 deadline with the chance of the FAA just kicking it down the road because they have the power to actually extend that deadline even further. So what's something else you can do? Well, you can take the similar route that the town of Superior did and ask to ban touch and goes if leaded fuel is being used. Touch and goes, obviously, I talked about, have the most impact on proximate communities. And airport sponsors can ban types of activities based off of safety, which is under Grant Assurance number 22. And it does not violate the Airport Noise and Capacity Act, since aircrafts can still depart and return. And general aviation aircrafts are not actually under Airport Noise and Capacity Act, so they're not even covered by that. Something else you can do is you can ask the airport to institute landing fees. Every time, it's a simple idea. Every single time the wheels touch the ground, a small fee is added. And it's used across many general aviation airports and can be instituted today if the airport allows it. It would discourage heavy touch and go traffic work patterns over communities. Most general aviation traffic is unaffected by the small one-time fee, but the constant taking off and landing, those would be discouraged. Now, the issue with this is if you propose it as a method to control activity at the airport, the FAA will shoot it down immediately. The FAA says that you cannot use landing fees to discourage activity, but only as a means to increase revenue at the airports. It must be brought up that way instead, which I find to be extremely ironic, because if you actually look up landing fee on Wikipedia, it goes and highlights Santa Monica's landing fee that is used to dissuade pilots from landing at the airport. Furthermore, a lot of airports say, well, this wouldn't work because it only affects those who are visiting the airport, not the tenants at the airport. That Santa Monica's model, before they closed, showed that you can actually use it on both tenants and those visiting the airport. So it is a possible avenue, but it's tricky how you have to word it and approach it in that sense. Finally, the last thing you can do is just try to mitigate the exposure that you are having on yourself and your family, which is the unfortunate part that it's very difficult to do when this lead is so prevalent in our environment. So the first thing I would recommend is just simply get a blood test to make an educated decision of how much you are actually being affected by this. If you're thinking about starting a family, if you are testing with higher levels of lead, then you might consider moving, unfortunately, or taking other precautions to help reduce the amount of lead exposure. You can do things like using a wet cloth to dust rather than doing a dry dusting so you don't push the particulate around. You can keep your windows and doors closed during high activity periods and don't go outside during high activity periods. And kudos if you can convince a representative to actually supplement energy costs for low-income homes to offset the air conditioning costs. Avoid eating fruits and vegetables from your backyard gardens, because not only can these leaded particles be on top of the fruits and vegetables, but plants tend to absorb these heavy metals, including lead from the soil, which can then be ingested. This is the same reason why in Leyden and Candelas, you have a disclosure on your house saying do not plant root vegetables because you might take up plutonium and you might ingest it. Remove shoes in the homes to prevent tracking outside lead indoors. Wash your child's hands often, especially before eating and sleeping, to prevent lead exposure in that way. And then cover exposed soil with grass, plants, and other ground cover like bark and gravel to prevent the kickup of dust, which would then cause lead exposure. Now, I know that these decisions that you have to make are very tough and very personal. But hopefully the ideas here will help you make an educated choice. I know some people have come to me and said, well, your children will be smart. They can afford to lose a few IQ points, but that's not really the point of being a parent. The point of being a parent is to try to have your child exceed and excel and to see their full potential. And if I had the power to protect not my child, but every child's future and potential, I would do it in a heartbeat. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there questions in the room? I have a few that came in online, but Mary, go ahead.
So I know that there have been a lot of studies about adults, but as an adult that lives really close and works outside, a farm stand and vegetables and, I'm being exposed. I want to expose other people like, well, I'm probably as smart as I'm gonna get going downhill, but still, I don't want to be exposed. Like, what is known about adult exposure?
So again, there's not as many studies for adults for constant low-level lead exposure. There are studies looking at higher levels of lead, reaching 5 to 10 micrograms, et cetera. And those have been shown to cause heart effects and shown to cause hypertension and all sorts of health effects. So it does affect you. I just don't know where the threshold is for an adult. And the studies have not been really looked at, long, low-level lead exposure. For children, it's very obvious. Even at low-level lead exposure, there are health effects. But for adults, I'm not too sure. Again, at the high level, it's things like heart disease, things like hypertension. I think it's also been linked to dementia, but don't quote me on that. So I think you have to talk to your doctor about what that would be.
So would then like the half-mile radius or be at a high level?
You can be. Now, it's going to affect every person differently, which is why I encourage everyone to get a blood lead test, so that way you know where you're at, and you can make an educated choice on that matter. So, for example, in the Reed-Hillview study, they actually looked at 2 children, one who went to school right next to the airport and one that went away from the airport. Even though they lived in the same neighborhood, the one who went to school further away had lower blood lead levels compared to the one that actually stayed close to the airport. Makes sense, they had time away. If you spend a lot of time outdoors, unfortunately, you're exposing yourself more often to these lead particulates. So maybe your blood levels might be higher, but you also might, hate the sound of planes. So you might not want to work outside when they're flying around. So that might help as well. So it's going to affect everyone differently depending upon how often they put themselves in a situation that expose themselves to lead. So I can't give you a definitive answer. The best option is just basically make an informed choice, talk to your doctor, get a blood lead level test, and go from there.
Are most blood tests equal?
So no, it's going to depend upon which lab you go to. Most of them are sensitive down to about 2 micrograms per deciliter. Those that the scientists use for very involved studies go to much higher precision. But that should be at a level that should give you an understanding of what's going on. I think.
Is a single blood level test indicative? It would seem that you need
So if you had an acute exposure, say, for example, I, ate a bunch of lead, then you would probably see high levels of lead for a while, and then it slowly would start to decay as, your body starts to lyse cells, slough off things, and things would eventually go down. But when you have constant level of lead exposure, the levels seem to be pretty constant. It's basically, it's a race of how fast can your body expel the lead versus how quickly is your body getting lead exposure. And when you're in an environment where there's constant levels of lead, then you are going to see that it is going to be fairly level. Now, that being said, both in the Reed Hillview study and in the Colorado Department of Public Health study, they noticed that during the summer months, the lead was higher in children compared to the winter months. This makes sense because there's a lot more activity in the summer months. Not only that, but it's hotter, so they have to rev up the engine a lot more to get off the ground and therefore expel a lot more lead. So there's more lead exposure. In the winter, the weather's not as nice, so they don't necessarily fly as much, and therefore it decreases slightly. But so it's basically it's a rate balancing act.
But now that's measuring it, sorry, and if I can encourage everyone to speak up so that the recording will catch your voice.
I can also repeat the question as well. So I think that'd be good. So the question was, can you actually repeat it?
Oh, I was asking about one blood level
Yep.
test versus multiple tests.
Yep.
And now I'm going to ask about lead in the blood versus lead that is being absorbed into tissues. Is that different? I mean, your blood is moving, it's.
Yep. So the blood part is so it's going to be, your body tries to keep itself in some sort of like homeostatic state where basically things are balanced around. So you're going to have blood in your tissue, blood in your blood, blood in your bone, not blood, lead in your tissue, lead in your blood, and lead in your bones actually. And so what happens is over time, if one area like your blood starts to have lower amounts of lead, well, that's going to leach out lead from other parts of your body to keep up that balancing act. So yes, there might be some like lead in your tissue, but it's going to be dependent upon how much lead is in your blood and how much lead is in your bones.
So it's a balance across blood and tissue.
Correct. So basically, if all of a sudden like you remove one from one, you magically snap fingers and you're all of a sudden you have no more lead in your blood, well, it'll start leaching from your tissue and leaching from your bones to replace that lead. So it is going to be balanced.
I'm a lawyer, so I'm interested in some of the what can be done issues. Now, I don't really, I haven't dove into this, into the jurisdictional issues, but I'm really interested in those issues. I know you're a scientist, right? But you have to understand some of the ways in which cities and the FAA and the state can regulate in this area. So I'm confused. Okay. It seems like the FAA has control over airports, right? And airspace around airports. And that the FAA has control jurisdiction, I would assume exclusive jurisdiction for preemption over certain levels of aircraft. You mentioned that a lot of these planes are not subject to the act that you were describing, and I didn't hear the name of the act.
Correct. Yep. So the airport, it's ANCA, and it's the acronym is ANCA, and it's the Airport Noise and Capacity Act. So for those online, the question was confusion over where the FAA regulates and where there's local jurisdiction, and where those lines cross. So to kind of go back and look at that, the FAA, so the airport is required to be up to certain standards. The airport is required to be up to certain standards with the FAA. When they take grant funding, they have certain assurances they promise to the government that they will do certain things, like they will not discriminate against certain type of activity unless it has to do with safety. They cannot, they have to charge.
Did you say unless that's to do with safety?
Correct. So there's key parts of it. So for example, you don't want to have a helicopter school where there's a skydiving, school as well. Like there's very obvious things. But if this is an area that has not been well explored, if you are exposing and there is a danger to communities from lead, well, could you step on in and say, well, this is not a discriminatory act, but a safety act to prevent, to help the welfare of the community around it. Now, to go on to what you said next, which is that part of those assurances that they have to allow certain types of airports cannot restrict activities based off of time and activity if they are a certain type of aircraft. Usually it's like jet engines. There's like aircraft type 1, type 2. I don't quote me on that. We could maybe go back and look at the literature, but general aviation is not under that. They are not susceptible. Do not go by the same regulations as like freights do, carriers do. And the reason why is because back, in the 90s, when California started restricting and creating curfews left and right, Congress got really scared and said, well, if everyone starts doing this, then that's going to start hurting the economy. We can't actually trade and transport things around. So they said, no, you can't restrict access to these airports for certain types of aircrafts. General aviation is not under the ANCA Act.
Okay, but what you've described is not really a jurisdictional issue. It's more of a golden handcuffs.
Correct. Correct. And that's usually how airports operate under golden
They
handcuffs.
issue the grant to help the city or develop the airport, and that comes with strings.
Correct. Correct.
So that's kind of the issue, keeping cities from regulating robustly.
Correct. And so airports do have, and so when I brought up like the landing fees, airports do have control over their fee structure for renting and for landing fees. So that's something they do have control over. So that's why it can be used as a tool. So airports do have a lot of tools, and there are people you can talk to who are in this room who have dug in this a lot more than I have. So I'm just kind of skimming the surface and the cliff notes, but there are avenues for that. For example, the lawsuit in Superior against the homeowners. Jefferson County said that it was this homeowners sued the airport for inverse condemnation, being like, you are taking from us. And the Jefferson County said, well, it's preempted by federal law. It actually went all the way up to federal court. The federal court said, no, it's not preempted, and shot it back down to local court. So not everything that the FAA does and is preempted by federal law. So there are avenues.
So I think we have a couple more questions in the room, and then we'll get a few online. And Robert, you might want to take down your slides.
Perfect. I didn't know if I need to go back to the slides, but it sounds like it's not necessarily need to go back to the slides. So let's stop sharing and turn on my video. Stand in a position where people can see me.
Wonderful, thank you.
So a lot of the pilot supporters refer to these environmental testing by engineering. They do soil and sample testing, and they show up with 0, and they say, not a problem. Yeah, the lead seems to be going somewhere, but we can't measure it, so it's not unsafe. Don't stop us from burning that.
Yep.
What can you say about that? So
that's a great question. Something I didn't really have time to really go over. So the study you're referring to is the one that the town of Superior did to try to verify our findings in homes, where they went out and tested soil levels, they tested air quality, et cetera. And that test was heavily flawed. For example, what we did and what Centennial did is we used a method to actually detect lead called inductive mass spectroscopy, which basically is a far more sensitive version of a mass spec to detect these lead levels compared to other methods. This is sensitive down to nanograms, and we were detecting micrograms, tens of micrograms of material in Centennial. So the method there was extremely sensitive. Comparatively, what Pinion did and what Town of Superior did, their firm, the firm they hired, used something called atomic absorption spectroscopy, which is extremely insensitive. It can actually only measure down to 90 micrograms per gram of material, which is way higher. In fact, it is so insensitive with the new EPA regulations for what is safe in soil, which is about 80 micrograms per gram, it wouldn't even be able to detect that. So them saying, oh, we didn't see anything, we didn't find anything, there's no lead there, we're fine. No, it does not mean that whatsoever. It just means that the method they used was flawed and could not go and detect below that threshold. So they have lead levels below that threshold is all it means. And as we've seen from many studies from Reed Hillview, the Colorado Department of Health, you are seeing an effect from these avgas emissions. The last one I'll talk about, which is they actually did, the Town of Superior tried to do a air sampling test where they tried to sample particles from the air to try to quantify it. And so I mentioned that these particles are about 13 nanometers in diameter. The filter that they were using was 300 nanometers in diameter. That's equivalent to throwing a baseball through a net 15 feet wide and hoping to catch it. You're not going to find anything using that. So it was heavily flawed. And so if you do want to go out and try to test for lead in your environment, I do recommend you search for a firm that does inductively coupled mass spec spectroscopy to get the most sensitive and most accurate information about what's going on in your neighborhood.
So a couple of questions from online.
We'll go a question online, maybe back into the room.
Okay, online. Has any of the lead that was found on interior windowsills in Superior been looked at by an E-microscope to determine the size of the lead dibromide particulates on those windowsills in Superior?
I can't comment on that, unfortunately. So,
No comment.
no comment on that.
Next question. While many of us have taken in soil samples to send to labs, there is usually a small amount found. Would it be worth taking samples and taking them to a lab to determine that the lead exists by sending those samples to a lab to observe with a microscope?
So it's difficult to do that because you're basically looking for a needle in a haystack. So it's very difficult to do that. And soil samples, there's an issue with that as well because these lead particulate is kind of going onto the surface, but when you take a lead soil sample, you're actually kind of digging in 3 inches into the earth and pulling it out. So you're heavily diluting your sample. So I wouldn't really recommend doing that. It's very difficult to go ahead and there's a few methods that I have posited in the past to go ahead and look at these particles. I wouldn't recommend using the method that Griffiths used because that would be very difficult. It's looking for a needle in a haystack. But you could theoretically filter out the particles depending on size, and then use that to narrow down your search for the particle itself. So you can get rid of the large particles, over 100 nanometers in size, and only look at what's left about below 100 nanometers. That will, lower your search area. So you could use something that is a little bit more broad spectrum, like electron microscope with some spectroscopy to actually look to see how much lead is actually there. It's difficult. It's very, very difficult. But it could be possible.
One more online, then we'll come back to the room. And again, we have some very sophisticated folks joining us online. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment Study has supposedly been peer reviewed. Have you read or do you know of this peer review and how one can get access to it? Yes,
it is currently available online. If you just, how did I find it? I went through Scholarly. If you go to googlescholar.com and just type in Colorado Airport lead study, I believe it's the first link, and it's free, it's online, and I actually cited it in my presentation. And so peer reviewed is basically, I really want to emphasize, is the highest form of scientific ethics there is, because it's not only the authors, but also the reviewers who go through and make sure that the science is up to snuff. So Google Scholar and look for Colorado Airport Lead Study. I believe it's the first link, and that's how I found it. It's in a free journal, so anyone can download it and see it.
Thank you so much. Back to folks here in the room.
Or are HEPA filters for indoor air quality of any value?
So the answer to that is no. When I first found about that there was lead in near my house, because I happen to live nearby an airport as well, I went out and bought the best HEPA filters on the market, which went down to about 100 nanometers inside. It was during the around COVID, so it was just like, oh, I could filter out COVID, which is over a certain size. And then I found out that the particle size was an order of magnitude smaller than that. So HEPA filters don't do much to help protect you and your home from lead particulate. The best option is just to try to keep it out of your home. So unfortunately, it doesn't do a very good job of protecting you.
So I don't see any other hands here in the room. Okay, one more, and to say for folks who are joining us online, if you're trying to submit a question online, please use the Q&A function in the webinar. Q&A function. Okay, back to the room.
I don't know, maybe this was out of your purview, but so it seems kind of asinine that this is the poison. There's no doctrine of protection to follow. Prove that it's safe, and the FAA seems to be all powerful. I mean, but what happens if you buck the FAA and say, all right, we are going to ban leaded fuel, and we'll take the consequences because the health of our citizens is higher than the joy of our pilot community.
So with the new FAA Reauthorization Act, the reason why it's really hard to get rid of leaded fuel with the FAA Reauthorization Act. I believe, and I'm probably quoting this wrong, but I believe the clause is, if you ban leaded fuel, the airport will be fined $5,000 per day until leaded fuel is offered again. So it's a very steep cost to ban leaded fuel. Now, that being said, there are some wiggle room about the definitions of that clause. Maybe our lawyer friend in the room would like to look into that a bit more. The clause specifically states until there is a commercial alternative. And the question becomes, is GAMI that commercial alternative? Does it actually fall under that category? Because it is commercially available and it's good for all airplanes. It just has not met it hasn't gone through the second testing phase, which would make it industry standard. That's the only thing it has not gone through. So there's a question of, well, would it be close enough to actually go around that clause? So if you offered GAMI at the airport, that would be an option. But again, that's really iffy. So there's really hard mechanisms that the FAA has put in the new Reauthorization Act to prevent that from happening.
We have another similar question from online. And Dr. Boutelle, this is not a question for you. There might be other folks in the room who would have an answer, but do you know of any airports who have tried to ban touch and goes if leaded fuel is being used? And have any airports received feedback on this from their lawyers?
Not specifically banning touch and goes for lead, but Torrance Airport recently banned touch and goes at their airport, and they did also receive an FAA grant for infrastructure grant. That's the only one I know of that has actually banned touch and goes at the airport. I don't know what's happening with that beyond that. This happened, I believe, in January of this year or end of last year. I haven't heard of any difference otherwise, but I could be very wrong if it's been overturned.
That's Torrance, California.
Torrance, California. Yep.
Very, yeah.
So if the EPA banned lead in cars, and we know that, of course, and we know that our gas has more lead in it, The EPA doesn't have any control over that?
So there is a current fight between the EPA and the FAA determining who has jurisdiction over this. The EPA says that we should be able to control how much lead is emitted at these airports because that's our job. But the FAA says, well, we determine what is safe to put inside of these airplanes. Because if the fuel doesn't have enough octane, if it sputters, the engine stalls, it's a safety issue and that plane can fall out of the sky. So it is under our jurisdiction. So there, with the EPA endangerment finding, that's the EPA's first, step into the FAA being like, look, we have to start doing something about it. But it's an extremely slow process. They've, made an announcement, but they're not going to really do it. They're now, I think, in a 2-year period of discussions before anything is actually going to be announced.
Once the lead falls to the ground, is in the soil, how dangerous is it? And how can it be remediated?
So it's a good question. I don't actually have a good answer to that. So it will accumulate in the soil a bit. And so it's a question of, well, what metric do you go off of for what is considered dangerous? Do you go off of the EPA's limit, which is currently 80 micrograms per gram of soil for the concentration? Or you just say, look, the current amount that we have is affecting children in the area. We're already at too much. Lead doesn't go away. It can blow around. It can basically go into the water supply. It can do a bunch of other stuff, but it's not something that basically decays. It's an element on the periodic table. It'll stick around until it's basically is taken away. So the EPA will say, well, the soil levels are fine because you aren't at high enough levels. But your blood will say, well, I'm still exposed to it. So, and my blood is going up and it's going to, harm my health, etc. So it's a question of what is best for you. So I don't have a good answer for that. But the best option is basically to remediate the soil by basically putting a layer on top of it. But then as planes continue to fly, more lead will be deposited. So it's just a never-ending cycle, unfortunately. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Is human health impacted by lead in soil? Like, how would it get out of the soil into your body? Is it
So-
a root vegetable that is grown in the soil? If you walk barefoot, like, how's the lead getting from the soil into a human?
So you brought up one option, which was if you eat your vegetables, if they were to absorb the lead from the soil and you were to eat it. Another way, if the dust were just to kick up and into the air again, you are then exposing yourself once again. If there's a windy day and all of a sudden there's a bunch of dust particulate in the air, then you're going to expose yourself to the lead. So it's always around. It's just a question of, is it in a form that is going to impact you?
This might not be your area, but I'm wondering if you're aware of any impact on property values around an airport due to lead.
Yes, you can easily just point to a house that has lead paint and a house that does not have lead paint. House that lead paint is going to have lower property value compared to one that does not have lead paint. And there's a stigma associated with that as well. If you go to a house and you have to disclose that there's lead in this home, you might walk away and you'll have a smaller buyer set who will actually look at the homes. The question, and I believe in California, they actually the real estate people had to actually put forth disclosure saying you're close to an airport and are at risk of lead exposure. Has not happened in Colorado yet, but I believe in California they have made moves to do that, and that would definitely affect property values as well.
So that might put a property owner in a bind. We do in Colorado have to disclose anything we know about a property when we put it on the market.
Correct.
And so if one was to do a windowsill test, I think the property disclosure form may only ask about lead paint per se. But if you were to, do a windowsill test and find lead, that would be an awkward
Agreed. It's definitely agreed, which is why for a lot of my presentations, I never disclosed whose homes those were, because there was a gray area legally for that, and I don't know the answer to that. You can make an argument that, again, if you're in a home in the mountains far away from the airport, and you decide, oh, actually, I'm going to, go out and look for some lead in my home for whatever reason, you might actually find some natural abundance of lead in your home. Would you have to disclose that because it's just naturally abundant? At what threshold does it start becoming, well, you have to start disclosing that? I don't know the answer to that question.
And then if you were a homeowner and you were worried, you have to make that difficult decision.
Correct. Correct.
Another question about remediation. So there have been airports where precision airplanes have flown. And it needed some kind of remediation, and then the land was repurposed and it became, for example, the Stapleton neighborhood.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yep.
Talk about that process and what happens to make it safe for people to do.
That I don't know for sure. I imagine it would be something similar to what was done in Louisville after the fires, what was done in Rocky Flats after that fire as well with plutonium. It's probably a very similar process. The top layer of soil was removed, probably about 8 to 12 inches, and a new top layer of soil was put on top of that. That's typically how I understand remediation process operates, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But then afterwards, the government says, okay, just don't go digging too deep down and you're fine.
Any other questions for Dr. Boutelle here in the room? I don't see any more online. Well, Dr. Boutelle, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, no problem.
Your time today, for coming out on a holiday weekend. So appreciated your knowledge shared with us today. Thank you.
Hopefully be of help.